So there have been these scenes of protests in China all over social media in the last couple of days. They finally made it onto the mainstream media this morning. People over there are basically angry at Xi's zero COVID approach, which involves mass testing, quarantines and snap lockdowns. Demonstrators in Beijing last night called for the resignation of the Premier Xi Jinping, and our political correspondent Tom Harwood is with me now. Very unusual, Tom, isn't it, to see a population which is normally so subservient and so compliant taking action like this?
It's an incredibly unusual set of events that we've seen in the last 48 hours in particular, starting as sort of a very specific protest about the way in which people were physically locked into a tower block that caught fire, protesters saying that 10 people died who didn't need to have died due to the incredibly harsh restrictions that the Chinese Communist Party has placed on parts of the country in their zero COVID policy. But the significant thing is that this has spread. It's not just one sort of pocket of protest. This is now growing in many different cities across the country. It's growing in university campuses as well as large population centres. And that's something that's very specific because there have been little protests about things in the past in China. Usually they're contained and they don't really make it into the Western media at all. Indeed, they don't really make it into the Chinese media. People in the country don't know about them. The fact that this protest has spread and grown organically and actually gone much more widely than the specific event that started it. People are now calling in some of these protests for Xi Jinping to resign. And that is a really, really difficult thing to say in a country like China. It's a really profound moment.
There are all sorts of reasons as to why this might be gaining this momentum at the moment. Obviously, social media, even in China where it's heavily policed, is making an impact. There have been thousands of videos on TikTok showing these protests. And there's also, of course, the theory that pictures of the World Cup have been seen over in China. And they're obviously saying, well, hang on a minute, you don't have people in stands, thousands of people without masks, aren't locked in their house. And this has sort of lit the touch paper for these protests to be emerging over there. We've also seen these pictures of these quarantine camps, Tom. Have you seen these images of these look like sort of metal boxes in the desert? There's one in Guangzhou city which has 90,000 isolation pods. Have the Chinese government said anything about those particular quarantine camps and what their purpose might be?
The Chinese government doesn't, as a rule, comment on these things. They're incredibly secretive, and indeed they don't want to add fuel to the fire on any of these points. But it's interesting to see sort of how they have been sort of struggling to respond to these new protests over the last 2 days. The Chinese government hasn't really put out any clear statement. There have been some arrests of protesters, but the sort of Tiananmen-style crackdown has not yet taken place. It is interesting to see why perhaps the government hasn't sort of sent in the tanks already. Perhaps their view is that these are simply too numerous as protests to do their traditional harsh clampdown at this stage, that might have political ramifications. It's a potentially dangerous moment for this government because you're seeing really unprecedented civil disobedience from people. And let's not forget what a brave thing it is to do, to go out onto the streets and protest in China.
I think you were talking to somebody this morning about this, weren't you? Was that on breakfast?
I was talking to Luke de Pulford, the human rights campaigner. He works with the International Parliamentary Alliance on China, on my show a little bit earlier. He was talking about the particulars of how the Chinese Communist Party may well respond to these protests, and indeed what the British government should do as well.
Let's watch that.
I think there are a number of things to take into account. Obviously, the economic impact has been exceptionally difficult for many, many people in China. It's really hurt their businesses. It's meant that they can't go about their daily business. Their normal bustling cities, which are normally full of commerce, haven't been able to operate as usual. But there are many other things besides that. Fascinating analysis coming through around the World Cup, for example. You've got a lot of people in China who are looking at those crowds, many crowds in Qatar, who are all there together, cheek by jowl, enjoying the football. Well, China's been so worried about this being broadcast throughout the country that they're censoring crowds. They're making sure that nobody can actually see that there are people not wearing masks in the crowds in the World Cup. And that has also added to the anger. So Look, there are many things all combining here. I think it's partly the lack of information that people within China have about other people's COVID policies outside of China. That's angered people a lot. It's the Urumqi fire, which was, really terrible. The reports are that they couldn't get out because the doors themselves had been barricaded by the authorities as a part of the extremely restrictive COVID measures. But yes, of course, it's the economy. People are going into their fourth year of this stuff now in China. They've had enough of it.